Okay, hopefully we're live.
Hello, everyone. Is anybody out there? Well, we're here with my friend John, Max von Deadlock, our studio painter. And, well, what are we going to do today, John?
Hey James, so we are going to be painting Sage. So I know he's a particular favourite of the Drowned Earth sculpts,
He
and
definitely has been, yeah.
yeah, I mean, what's not to love about um, a gorilla with a sort of a slightly steampunk gorilla in the Drowned Earth setting. With this rather intriguing facial expression on him. I love this sculpt actually. I have to say. I'm with those who particularly enjoy this sculpt because although he has a fairly static pose, right? He's just kind of standing there,
Yeah.
just holding his pickaxe and so on. But there's something I think rather intriguing about the way he's just kind of staring at that little lizard, which I'm just sort of holding up there. I've got a little bit of colour on him already, so people who are watching will see that I've already started. So I'm not starting from scratch here,
You
and
mean we're not going to paint the whole thing in an hour?
I wish I could, but yeah, it's definitely something that takes a few hours, takes many hours. Actually, it's a question I get quite often as a painter. Is how long does it take to do it? And I mean, obviously, it's a bit of a how long is a piece of string type answer, but I went through an exercise of I guess trying to speed up my painting and taking a real and actually timing myself and doing some little hourly blocks. And actually on my blog, which I guess you can probably see the link on screen there, I did an exercise where I actually took a photo after every hour of painting an infinity miniature, and I think I ended up taking about 3.5 to 4 hours on that one. But that was very much for sort of a high tabletop standard, whereas something like this, a sort of a showcase standard of mini, I would probably envisage taking upwards of 10, 15 hours, depending on the mini and so on. So anyway, I guess I should get started instead of just holding him up for people to see. I mean, I'm just rotating him now so that people can see, where we're at with him, and hopefully the camera is focusing okay and the colours are coming through. Maybe it's a little overexposed, but it'll probably do. I'm going to plop him down, and I can. I have to apologise that my webcam, by the way, is that I've got over my wet palette is not the sharpest, but hopefully it'll be still useful. You can see what colours I'm picking up on the brush and so on. In fact, if I
Yeah. I mean,
move my sorry, James, go on.
no, I was just going to say when watching painting tutorials and things like that in the past, either on YouTube or just videoed things, you really miss not being able to see where the brush goes and what the brush is doing. So having that little, even if it's flickering a bit, having that shot on the wet palette, I think is really great.
Yeah, it's definitely something I'd like to get a crisper image on that with a better color reproduction as well, because it'd be good to. I think another good thing is to understand how much a painter thins the paints. This is the common mantra. I think there are two mantras that that any painter will, or sort of experienced painter tends to throw out. One is thin your paints. That's always the first thing people say. Thin your paints. And the second one is about contrast, contrast, contrast. So if thin your paints is one of the key things that people are told to do to improve their painting, then how do you know how thin it should be? And I mean, the answer to that is actually it depends what you're doing,
Yeah,
whether you're washing, whether you're highlighting, and it's also going to depend on what your painting style is. And when I
yeah.
actually get going with the painting, you'll get a sense of how I do it, which is a little bit slapdash, I'd say. But
Well,
we'll see
I
that.
I wrote blog article on exactly that, because I think that bit of advice is potentially really dangerous. People just sort of, blanket, however much you're thinning your paints, it's not enough, thin them more, and things like that. And you hear a lot of sort of, professional painters giving advice like that, and I think it's actually really unhelpful, because it's not the whole picture. And what you just said about, well, it depends on which job you're doing, is that, absolutely right. And I wish you'd hear more people saying that when people are asking for advice about how to level their painting up, step up to the next level.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was going to show you actually the reason. So it's a bit boring on the feed at the moment. People are just looking at a Tupperware tub with some with some kitchen towel and some a baking sheet on it. So really, this is my wet palette that I'm going to use. It's a very simple one. Like I said, I think this is an old takeaway container. I think it had a nice, delicious Thai curry in it one day, some years ago. And what I've done is I've just actually laid out some kitchen towel, a couple of sheets of white kitchen towel that act as the reservoir. Some people use like a sponge, but
Yeah.
I tend to use my just kitchen towel. I can wring it out and dispose of it, so it's a disposable thing. And then on top, I've laid a sheet of baking paper. I think it's either baking parchment or baking paper, unfortunately, without going into the kitchen to figure out which one it is. But you do have to be a little bit careful, because one of them has like a silicone coating, and it doesn't allow any moisture through. And the key thing about that is that you kind of want that a little bit of moisture to seep through, and that will keep the paints a bit fresher than if you just did them on a flat surface. So that's
So I find for people in the UK, or certainly in England anyway, my experience is that the brown baking paper is no good. It's the white stuff you want. And that isn't
yes,
just because it's easier, seeing the colors is much better on a white piece of paper. But I find that the brown stuff breaks up as you're agitating the water and the paint on it, and you end up with little bits of fiber in your paint, which is not helpful.
yeah, absolutely. So I'm just dolloping a little bit of paint, trying to give them a good shake, which is obviously a key thing to do. And I'll talk a bit about the paints and the paint brands and stuff like that in a bit, but I'll come back to those in a second. But I just thought I'd better get them on the wet palette, and I'll also talk a bit about what I'm going to be doing, which bit of the model. Oh, excuse my arm coming through there. Okay, so here we go. Now, one thing is, so going back to that statement as well about contrast. I actually find myself, and I know in terms of colour theory, and I'll probably come back to this later after we've actually done a bit of painting, talking about colour theory, that I often will go right down to black in the shadows and right up to white on the highlights, very small dot highlights or whatever, quite often. And so I really like strong contrast on a miniature. So actually, if I move that back over there, hopefully you can see that it's a
And
little bit
do you
yellow on a
attend
few bits.
to do you tend to apply that contrast throughout the model, or do you concentrate on certain parts? So, for example, you create as much contrast in the shoes as you do the hat, or do you kind of mix that up? So the contrast is over the whole miniature as opposed to in individual elements.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And this is actually about texture, I suppose. So I think it depends on the material, and really it's about the reflective properties or the material properties of what it is you're painting. And in fact, what I should do is actually try and do two things at once, which Mrs. Von Deadlock always laughs at me, my inability to do more than one thing at once. So
Well, you're only a man, John.
I know. Yeah, what was the question again? Oh yeah, it was about the material surface, and essentially reflective surfaces or shiny surfaces. You tend to have much sharper, or I think they call them specular highlights, and so you'll go right down to blacks and very sharp highlights. whereas something like some cloth or just a very flat surface, you'll have much more diffuse highlights, they're called. So if I think about the model here, so if I look at Sage, what I've done, so on here, I mean, I've probably over highlighted a little bit on his shirt. It's sort of, we do go up to kind of almost a white highlight on there on his shirt, but it's sort of, I guess I'm pushing the contrast probably a bit more than you would expect on a fairly matte kind of surface. Maybe on his this bit up here you can sort of see, so this is like by under his neck, the sort of the collar of the shirt, I think it is. It's, I don't have too stark highlighting going on, particularly where I'm at the moment with his pantaloons, his breeches, trousers, I don't know what you'd call them. But right now I don't have particularly sharp highlighting going on. This is definitely a work in progress, this bit. But then when you come to metals, for example, like, so if I look at the what I've done with the goggles up there, there's a real, see that I've put a let's see if I can get this in, get my brush roundabout to it. So just here you can see that little dot highlight there. So that's a good example of what we call a specular highlight. So imagine your sunglasses on a reflecting just that point of light really strongly. So essentially I'll tend to do flatter highlighting on a matte kind of surface, and sharper, crisper highlights on a shiny surface. Another example is I've got these sort of gold effect. So I've gone for what they call non-metallic metal, I guess, and really what I'm doing there is just showing a very high sort of reflective kind of highlighting on those buckles, I suppose. So yeah, going right from black to white in a very, very small area, and it really makes it look like it's shiny. Just double check my people should be able to see what's going on in the palette. So what I'm doing at the moment is I'm just painting on his belt pouch. Now in terms of the way I paint, actually I think I'm a little bit slapdash, and what I tend to do is go back and forth between sections. So actually you'll notice I've got some bits that I've kind of part done, and maybe I'm a bit of a magpie and go, a little bit bored of that bit, I'll go and move on to another section, and this might be where I could probably be a bit more disciplined, and sort of focus on one area to completion and then move on to the next. And I think that's how a lot of painters will.
Well, yeah, I mean, do you know what? I'm not sure there's a right or wrong way. The only important thing is the result, right? And if you asked, I imagine, 6 old master paintings, their technique, they'd give you 6 completely different answers. Some people like to build up the canvas as a whole so that they get a context of the entire thing as they're working, and some people have that mental vision of what it's going to look like, and so as you described, concentrate on each individual area and work it right up to the best level they can, and then move on.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely I feel like I need that holistic view of the miniature. I need to go back to it and say, do you know what? I think that's not quite working. Something needs to be addressed. Oh, it's this. This is what needs to be looked at. And until I've seen the mini together, all the pieces coming together, then it can be hard to do that. So.
Well, so for example, looking at the model as he is now, you've picked up a little bit of the color of his scarf, and put it into the crest of his head, the fur on his forehead. And that's something which maybe a lot of people wouldn't think to do, to tie it together, if they'd have done those elements one at a time.
Yeah, so with that one, actually, that came from a little bit of research, actually, that it turns out that when I was looking into guerrilla color schemes, so for choosing what colours to paint sage. Sorry, I'll make sure I have to keep checking myself to make sure that the bit that I'm painting people can actually see. It's all too easy for it to drift off camera. So when I was investigating, the colour schemes that you would use for a gorilla, they tended to be mostly grey, black and white, and the classic silverback gorilla. They tended to have almost towards white in their trousers, their rear legs. What would you call them? Their legs, I guess. Yeah. And then they often had a chestnut forehead, which I thought was interesting. And as you say, it's quite nice because in terms of colour balance, and that's something that I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to colour theory, and I do like to balance things out and think about colour theory. I think it's actually quite important for painting. Something that's really visually engaging. It applies to a lot of art, and I'm sure you can read many books on it. There's a particularly good one called Colour and Light by James Gurney, I think it is, who's the Dinotopia guy, who's probably very useful reference, I think, for a lot of Drowned Earth, because obviously he paints dinosaurs.
I may have all of those Dinotopia books.
I might need to borrow some off you, James, because I've just got the Colour and Light one, but it does some really good discussions about colour theory and sort of colour gamuts, I think they call them, where the overall colour palette that's used on the miniature. Now, with Sage, actually, people who are wanting to see me paint, and instead they're getting a lesson in theory, I guess. I'm going to pull in my colour wheel now. Hey, I like to keep my colour wheel handy. So basically, I'm sorry, it's a bit out of focus. I would readjust the focus on the camera, but I'm nervous that I won't be able to get it back again. So I'm going to keep it kind of slightly blurry, but it doesn't matter because we're talking about the colours. With what I tend to do, and this is definitely something I encourage people to think about when it comes to painting their miniatures, is to think a bit about the colour scheme that they're using and try not to overload with colours. What will often happen is you'll see people who will go, oh, I haven't used this colour yet, I'll paint this bit this colour, and we'll use quite strong primary colours, for example, and you end up with something that can look a little bit clown-like when you've got all the colours, all these saturated colours all over it. What I tend towards is I usually, so in the middle of this colour wheel, I'm just holding it up to the camera here in focus, there are it's quite a nifty little device. I just bought this from an art shop. And in this colour wheel, and I can spin it around, in this colour wheel it's got the different types of complementary colour schemes. And we probably know from basics of colour theory where we've got a simple, so there'll be colour complements, right? So around the outside of the colour wheel you've got the different hues of colour, and opposite on the colour wheel will be the complement of a given colour. Now, the interesting thing about that, and how we have to be a bit careful of this when we're highlighting and shading, is that if you try and shade with a complement of a colour, it tends to cancel it out and you get a grey colour scheme. I can actually demonstrate where I've had to kind of cheat. So those who paint Infinity miniatures or know Infinity will recognise this beefy chap. This is Ajax, and actually, one thing I had to do with him, I'd chosen to do a pretty crazy colour scheme so he's mostly in this sort of cold grey, but actually I wanted to do this kind of almost electric purple through orange and yellow shading on the armour plates to make it look like it's some sort of thermite, or I don't know what, or sort of chrome effect. Now the problem is, if I'm trying to shade from purple up through to yellow and white, they are completely opposite on the colour wheel. And if I just try to blend from purple to yellow, it would just go grey. So what I did
Yeah.
is I cheated, and I went all the way around the outside of the colour wheel for those sections. So I went from purple. It actually goes from a right in the shadows. It's even a very dark turquoise. It goes right up through turquoise into the purple, then round a sort of a red violet through orange, then up into yellow, and then up into white. So that's a pretty extreme example, but kind of demonstrating the complementary colours and how they affect us when we're shading. But the key thing is, usually what I tend to do is I will pick a split complementary colour scheme where I will start with, let's say in this case it would be violet, and then so I'd be painting some areas of the miniature violet, and I would tend to balance it with sort of a yellow, something from the yellow-orange hue and something from the yellow-green hue, and it will give you a nice balance. In fact, I can show you if I just twist it around one. I've got another miniature actually where I did it on my blog. I did an interesting this is a miniature from the Statuesque miniatures range. It was for a little online competition. We had a bit of fun, and I couldn't decide what colours to paint her, so I put a little call out on my blog to say I asked people to give me a random number, and somebody else to give me another random number, and I just put those into an online colour scheme designer to come up with a split complementary colour scheme. And what they chose was this blue violet, I think it was. Oh no, it'll be this one, wouldn't it? It'll be violet and yellow green and yellow orange, which basically we had that the violet with the yellow green for this kind of goop on the base, and then the orange for this sort of yellow orange for her shoulder pads, and obviously she's a redhead with a sort of ginger hair. So that was an example, I suppose, of me choosing a split complementary color scheme as a bit of a sort of practice example. I got another one here. Sorry, this is me showcasing miniatures, but it's a favourite. This is Hassle-Free Miniatures, Smudge, who's you can see I went to town and had a lot of fun on his base. I love pugs and bulldogs and the like, so this guy was a lot of fun to paint. But what I've done here is I've just simply got mostly this blue going against the orange brown. Pretty much a straight complementary colour scheme, and that orangey background really helps for Smudge to just pop out and draw the eye. Miniature painters will often talk about things popping. It's an interesting concept. They use it a lot, but really it's about this thing really should jump out. Now, I've sort of gone off rambling, I'm afraid, talking about colour theory, but on Sage I was a bit wary because we have a lot of colours going on. We've got some yellows, we've got some blues, we've got some greens, we've got some reds, and I was a bit wary that we're going a bit full on clown, right? Okay, I've not heavily saturated the colours, so that helps. But what I've actually got going on is another type of colour scheme, which is called a tetrad, where I've got four. So I've got two colours from one side of the colour wheel and two from the other side. So actually what we've got going on, we've got a sort of I think it was, sorry, it was this one. Here we go. So we've actually got a blue that's on his shirt, a sort of denim blue. Then green, I'll come back to that. So this is something that I think I need to adjust because at the moment I've got a bit too much yellow-green going on the sort of base coat I put on there. It's a bit too yellow-green, which doesn't quite fit doesn't balance too well on the colour scheme. And then I've got this kind of terracotta sort of colour, I suppose. Is it terracotta? Sort of or a coral kind of colour, which is what's going on his trousers. And then this kind of orangey brown, which is going to be his various bits of satchel and his scarf. So that's kind of what I'm doing in terms of colours, but like I said, I was a bit wary that there was a lot going on. But I think the key thing is about, and just to sort of bring it back to what we were talking about earlier on, that it's about getting that balance. And I think it's quite important that we make sure that across the miniature we have that kind of balance. I think here, we've got this sort of brownish, that sort of reddy brown colour, or the sort of coral colour coming through in his trousers, sort of mirrored a bit in the leather, that sort of orange brown leather straps, and then so what I'm thinking of doing here is, obviously I've just started painting on this pouch here, but actually I'm going to use this same colour scheme, I think, from his scarf down on the satchel pouches. So it's going to be a very kind of pale, light sort of tanned leather, I think. And I think
And is
that
that
should help
because you feel
balance.
like repeating that colour elsewhere kind of unifies the scheme a little bit?
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly. It just brings in that balance, that sort of harmony.
So what would be your advice to somebody who says, I don't know anything about color theory? How should I go about when I pick up a model and I want to start painting it? Normally, what I do is I just grab pots at random and I make it up as I go along. But what you're saying is I should plan ahead of time. How should I approach that?
what I would do is, and what I often do is, I like to think of one key colour that I fancy painting it, or I look at the mini and think, okay, this is going to be the dominant colour here, and then I would just simply go, okay, in terms of complements, colour complements, what would work there? What would, if I was going for, and I tend to just start off with that split complementary colour scheme, and I'll look at that and think, okay, yeah, that seems to work. Or sometimes what I'll find is that the dominant colour I've chosen, I will sort of flip it upside down and actually make what I think is the dominant colour, make it one of the two that were in the of the complementary colours.
Okay, yeah,
If that makes sense. Um,
yeah.
just in terms of what I'm doing here right now, so I'm back to painting the. Actually, I feel like people will be thinking, just get painting the damn mini, John. I didn't want to learn colour theory. I came here to watch some brush on mini action.
Well, you'll do like a bit of brush on mini action, but I think that one of the biggest problems that not necessarily starting painters, but people who've hit a glass ceiling and they don't know how to get better than where they are is a lack of planning and a lack of thought about what they're doing before they start doing it. And so I think talking about things like color theory and how and your mindset as you approach a model is every bit as important as technique.
Yeah, definitely, it definitely helps to plan. Um, so what I'm doing now is painting that. Actually, one thing that's happening off camera, I do apologise if I just skibble this over, and people should see it. I hope it doesn't muck up my setup. Is actually alongside my palette, I've got my trusty old Games Workshop water pot, and I think I get maybe slightly ridiculed when I wheel this one out, but I quite like it. And I always have it sat on a bit of tissue paper so I can just wipe off excess from the brush. Now, yeah, apologies that I don't have that actually on the camera. I've either got the palette or I've got the tissue paper or the water palette. But what I'm often doing is I will charge the brush, sort of load up the brush, and then I will just wipe the excess off so I don't flood the miniature. Now I'm actually as well, I'm painting fairly thick. We talked a bit earlier about how thick or thin the paints are. If you can see, it's a fairly, right now it's not very smooth, and the colours that have gone on pretty blotchily, and that's because the paints I used, they were almost unthinned actually. Um,
Yeah. You
uh,
just maybe mix a little bit into to loosen the paint up so that it
yeah,
behaves
so that
slightly better as you're, yeah.
it runs into the reservoir of the brush, right? So
And so what you were saying earlier about your trusty Games Workshop pot, when you see a lot of top level painters when they're painting, they have about 20,000 stripes on their fingers and thumb, um, uh, in various different colors. And I think what's happening there is they're doing the same as you're doing on your little paint pot. I notice your wet palette is a lot neater than mine is when I paint, because I do that on the. I don't use my
I see,
hand
I
and I
see.
don't use a pot. I do it on the palette. So I'm twisting the brush and adjusting. I'm testing, seeing how is the paint coming off the brush. That's what you're talking about, right?
I guess actually no, I don't think I test it. I am literally just and it may be habit as much as anything, to be honest. It may just be I'm so used to making sure I've removed removed all the excess that I just do it out of
Yeah.
habit now. In the same way that we might accidentally um, dip our brush in a cup of tea next to us because we're just used to kind of dunking.
Well, the
um,
question on everyone's lips, John, is are you a brush licker?
I am, I am indeed. Hope it's non-toxic, this stuff. Um, Actually, yeah. So that's a good point. I was going to talk about the paint brand I use. Um, so I, for the longest time, I have used. Well, firstly, I'll preface this to say I'm fairly paint agnostic, and in that I will use paints from any brand. Um, if it has the qualities that I like. So I'm not a purist. I don't. So quite commonly used. You'll find your. So actually, what we're using here, by the way. In fact, let me just pop him aside, and I can show you the colours that we've got going on here. The main one is we've got scale 75 walnut, or scale color walnut for the sort of brown tones on this pouch. With I guess the predominant color here is, or paint we're using, is Vallejo Deck Tan. So you can see already I'm using paint from two sources. Now I've only just picked up on the scale color stuff. I know a lot of painters use scale color now. For the longest time, people were using Vallejo. And for me, I got excited when I read a review about the scale color paints when they mentioned that they had a very, very matte finish. And I really like a matte finish when I'm painting. And after I finish painting a mini, I'll always matte it down with a bit of Army Painter anti-shine matte varnish, I guess it's called. I love that stuff. It's really good at matting stuff down. But what I found is with the Vallejo paints, fantastic range. I like the model color range because they tend to be quite a little on the desaturated side versus the game color range. Yeah, I like a bit more control over my saturation. I don't want to have to sort of keep desaturating things. And the thing I found with model color, although they're fairly easy for me to get hold of here in London, but they do tend to leave a little bit of a satin finish,
Yeah.
which is a bit distracting. And the reason I'm not so keen on that is because when you're painting, and I don't know if I can see if I can mimic it on Sage right now, I can see on his so here on at the bottom of his shirt, where I think I've used predominantly Vallejo colours, I can see that sheen. You see the light catching and
Well,
glistening
I
on the
find
satin
when
surface.
I find with a slightly satin finish, particularly well, I like to paint with a lot of light. It can be quite difficult to see what you're doing sometimes because you're getting that very slight glare off the paint surface.
Absolutely, and that's you have to compensate for it. You have to look at it and go, and maybe adjust the angle so that you're not getting the reflected glare. And so I like, I will always tend to. Oh, that's one of the reasons I like scale 75. Sorry, the scale color paints right now. Um,
Yeah,
I'm just starting to dabble with them, and I'm sure, to go back to what I was saying, I'm not just going to advocate one particular brand. So far, I'm enjoying these scale color paints because of that matte effect. But again,
I feel like they're definitely formulated for people that blend. I know. Let's put it this way: I probably wouldn't recommend them to somebody just starting out.
right?
Um, at times, they're quite thin. Not thin. I mean, they're very thick in
Oh,
texture.
I see. Translucent.
But they're quite translucent, and I feel like that's great if you're at the level of brush control where you're sort of using thin layers and playing around with the opacity. So, I mean, that's one of the advantages of acrylic paint, isn't it? Is that you've got that opacity to work with, and so you can create nice blends by using that to your advantage.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Um, Now I've kind of made this a bit muddy. Now, um, one thing I would say, and often people will ask, well, what would you recommend? What's the first recommendation for people who are starting out, or what are the key things that people should think about when it comes to painting or improving their painting? And I think it's a little bit, maybe it's a bit of a wishy-washy one, but I would say confidence. Just don't, I guess, don't worry too much. You don't. It doesn't matter if you make a mistake on your mini. You can always paint over it, assuming you haven't put on really thick dollops of paint. Um, so in this case, what I'm doing, I've sort of looked at this and gone, okay. Well, I think now that it's dried out, it's actually not too bad. But I was a bit worried that it was getting a little bit muddy. But I'm like, you know what? It doesn't really matter. I can always go back in and tidy things up. And especially when it comes to things like tidy or very very fine lines and highlights, that actually, in trying to just get um, a very fine line in one stroke is very difficult. Would take a lot of oops, bashing the screen with my brush. Yeah, it can be very, very difficult. But actually, a very good way to do it is if you um, paint a line. It might be a little bit too thick, and then you go back in and tidy it with another colour next to it. Then you can
Yeah.
get a very, very fine line. So now I'm going to turn them upside down. Let's see if I can get in here, and also so that you can see it. Um, this is a little bit awkward what I'm doing right now, but hopefully you can see where that's going in. So yeah, so I think a lot of that is that I'll put paint down and I'll probably come back over it. Now, I think this might be a difference when it comes to somebody who's a very fast painter, for example, who gets it right first time, or doesn't keep painting over the same surface many times. But I think for me, like I said, I tend to go back and forth a bit, and I do like to just sort of play and explore a bit and think, do you know what? I think that needs a little bit more there. So I'm less of a, I guess I'd say, paint by numbers, and I have to be careful not to. I don't want that to sound disparaging or in any way, but really it is about my process of just kind of doing a bit, thinking, how does that look? I think I'll come back to it. Um,
Well, I think there's another one of those things that you kind of need to get a hurdle that you need to get over is that so many of us, particularly of our generation, were taught to paint by White Dwarf magazine. The sort of heavy metal method, and that method is you lay down a color and then you layer that color with a bit of white in it on top, and then you layer it with a little bit more white, and then you call it job done and move on to the next color. So and that teaches people to think that one area, for example, you've painted his fur brown, let's say. But actually, when you look closely at what you've done around the head, there are a lot of different shades and colors in that. And generally, the the example I always use is when you're at primary school, how do you draw a tree? Um, it's a big, thick brown line with a green cloud on top, right? But when you
Yes,
actually look at a
of
tree,
course.
it doesn't actually have a brown trunk. And when you look at the leaves, there's greys in there. There's a little bit of red in that green in places. There's blue light bouncing off it. What makes up a color is much more complex than add a bit of white to the same color and that's a highlight. And so I think that's something that people battle with, and they see very well painted miniatures on the internet or at competitions and think, why doesn't my painting look like that? And I think part of the reason is it's just that people are trapped in a wrong way of thinking about color.
Yes, I definitely. Yeah, I think, and I can definitely see why. And I guess it's there are shortcuts. So, for example, there are some nice, easy to apply techniques. The likes of washing and dry brushing, that are really, they're good because they get you a result that approximates how you sort of the real light would interact. Um, they do a good enough job of approximation that you can get that result very quickly. Quick dry brush, do a wash, maybe pick out some highlights. Do a wash. Then it does a good enough job, and particularly if you're into you want to get your stuff to table quickly because you're more of a player than a painter. I tend to use that term in reverse there, but essentially you're like, I want to get some good results. I want something that I'm happy with. I'm looking at it from a distance of 3 or 4 feet anyway, so I want it to be good enough. And so we'll use those techniques. We'll just do some edge highlights, some dry brushing and washing. However, if people are wanting to take their painting to the next level, then what I would say is start thinking about your miniature as, I guess, a canvas. And this was a realization, I guess, that I had, where I was like, actually, what I'm doing here is I am choosing what color any particular part of this mini is going to be, as if I was painting on a canvas. And I know we've talked about this before, James, but the fact that I tend to, or I mean, one of the ways I will do things. So, for example, if I was to look at this satchel here, now I've given it a bit of it's actually had a zenithal undercoat with the airbrush, but I can come back to that later. But the traditional sort of paint by numbers way of painting that would be, or if I go back to, I suppose, my pouch here, that paint by numbers approach would be, I will paint it all my mid-tone. So in this case, I might have picked up the whatever it is, that deck tan that I've actually mixed in a bit with. So I'm not going for pure deck tan as my mid-tone. I've added a little bit of that walnut. I've sort of mixed in on you can see me mixing on the palette there,
Yeah.
and basically, they would paint the whole thing in the mid-tone, and then potentially go in with the highlight step where you would pick out the bits that you want to be in highlight. So in this case you'd be like, okay, I've painted the whole thing in my mid-tone, and now I will pick out the raised areas, because generally light will pick up on those raised areas. So I'll paint those raised areas with my highlight color, or highlight 1, and then I will go and do my shading step, and that's where you would basically take your shadow color, or shadow 1, and pick out and put it into the shadow areas. Now, where I'm going with this is that if you think of the miniature as a canvas, then I didn't need to paint the underside. So if I just hold it up here, where I've decided where the light doesn't reach so much, I've got an imaginary light source kind of coming in from sort of above and slightly to the right. It's a classic. We tend to, it's a fairly easy approximation, unless we're doing some special effect. We'd say, okay, imagine we've got a light source up here shining down. How would the light interact with that object? And in that case, the underside of the pouch would probably be in a bit of shadow. So I don't need to paint it with the midtone. I can go straight in because I've got my palette here, and I can go, do you know what? Blop. I'm going to stick some, the shadow tone. Oh, sorry, I keep pulling it off camera. So yeah, I'm going to put my shadow tone in there. And then I think, okay, well, and as I actually did, I've already done it early on. What I actually did was I decided that my highlight color, so where the light comes down and hits that object and kind of is reflected into my eye. That's one of the things that gets a little bit messes with your head a little bit. That actually the way optics work, I think, is that what we're seeing is the light reflected off that object. So the light is coming down here and bouncing off at an angle into our eyes, and because of the angle of it, there's actually more light on this surface than at the bottom, because right now it's on the underside of the on the pouch, it's just bouncing down there or whatever, and we're not getting so much of it. Anyway, effectively what you can say is, or a good approximation is that if the light, if the surface is kind of facing upwards, or is clearly has an unobstructed path to where the light source is, then it will be lighter, and therefore I will just paint it with a lighter color.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was me rambling on a bit about that. But you'll hear some painters referring to this as maybe zenithal shading. They certainly have talked about it in terms of say undercoating, base coating, where you get your airbrush and you basically spray from above as if it's that light source up above.
And so, would you say that gives a more realistic effect than the more traditional sort of old-fashioned Games Workshop way of just making all the high points lighter and all the deep points darker?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I was like, should I? What's my long answer to that?
So it's a zenithal light point, coming from above, as opposed to what's the opposite of zenithal? Well, not the opposite, but ambient. Not quite right, is it?
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I can't think. I think there is a term for it when the miniature is completely lit evenly.
Yeah.
But it tends to. I think it's an idea which is out of fashion nowadays.
Well, like I said, I think they do. I think it is. There's definitely an approximation of it. So you by just picking out, doing the edge highlighting. There is that is probably based in sort of optics and physics. That edges tend to catch, because there will be particularly sharp edges. There will be a part of that that edge which is actually directly facing towards you, and therefore it will be it would actually show that it would be well lit, I suppose.
Yeah.
And so the edge highlighting, as I said, it's a good approximation. I think I don't think like I said, it serves a purpose, and it's great for getting good results fast, and without having to spend a long time on it. Now, what I'm doing right now is I've been going back and forth. I think this is the perfectionist in me, where I'm going back and forth, and I guess because I know I've got people watching me, I'm like, well, I've got to get it absolutely perfect, right, while people are watching. So what I'm going to do now is, and this is something that happens quite a lot. And there's a particular journey. I know, James, you've painted your fair few minis, and very well, I might add, for people who don't know James's mini painting prowess. That
Well, they'll do because they've all seen the
Oh, of course, yeah. In fact, they probably
slightly
they may have
rubbishy photographs that we put up.
indeed. No, no, I'm not saying that the photographs are rubbishy, but no, I think they're splendid. But yeah, in what the journey that I often go on with a miniature. Sorry, I'm trying to keep it in focus as best as possible, but I guess the focal range on my sophisticated webcam, which by the way turned out to be an iPhone in the end, when I discovered we had some
Yeah,
fun
we
and
had
games.
all sorts of technical difficulties, didn't we? We were wondering whether we were going to be able to do this at all. So I'm aware, just to everyone who's listening, that the video is a little bit choppy from time to time. It's a problem we tried to sort out and just couldn't. It's better than it used to be, but so sorry about that. But I think I'm looking at it now, and I think it definitely serves its purpose. It illustrates very well what John's doing, and his sort of approach to painting a model.
Yeah, I don't know how artificial it is, given that I'm painting and talking. Well, I'm trying to explain topics and so on. So I'd like to think that this is how I normally paint, but oh dear, I've gone and stuck that hasn't worked. I think that probably just demonstrates what I was saying, that what I've just done here is I've put a big dollop of brown, which I'm not happy with, but hey, it doesn't matter. I've got my palette here, I've got all my range of colours, and I can just go in and just sort of just tidy it up. I think because my paints are and maybe as James was saying about the translucency of this particular paint range, that it does help with blending. It's sort of very slightly thinned, and I'm able to just kind of dab it a little bit to just to sort of smooth blends off and so on. And because the colour is actually very close to the underlying colour, then it just sort of blends it all in. So right, what I was actually doing is, and I was talking about starting to talk about a journey that I go on quite often with a miniature. I have this moment where I'll spend some time painting it, and I'll just think something not right, something's not working, and I can get a little bit disillusioned, or I used to. But what I realised is often it was about contrast. I hadn't got the shadows in yet, and as soon as I then start just going in with the deep shadows, it really would just bring it to life.
Yeah.
And
I've also found that when you're painting quickly, because I have for quite a few years now been commission painting, but commission painting table, better than tabletop, but the sort of higher end of gaming miniature that you're actually going to play with, standard. And for that, you can't be a perfectionist. You have to leave little mistakes here and there that don't show up to the naked eye, really, unless you really scrutinize the model very carefully. And that's not what you're trying to do with a gaming model. But I found that a lot of the time, while I was painting a model and there was an area that I really wasn't happy with, or a blend wasn't particularly smooth, it was a bit untidy, and I wanted to go back and labor over it and tidy it up, that actually if I left it but then I just ramped up the contrast, so I put in more shadow, more highlight, the imperfections in the midtone would just completely blend in, and they'd become invisible.
it covers a multitude of sins, is what you're saying.
Pretty much, yeah.
So
That's my style.
that's a little cheat step.
But yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that. Ramping up the contrast doesn't give the eye time to notice those little inconsistencies, because you're just absorbing a wider range of contrast, literally.
Yeah. So I'm having a bit of difficulty, as you may have noticed, having a bit of difficulty getting the the paint on the top of that top of his pouch, because the angle that I'm trying to do it at is in conflict with where my camera is, and so I'll probably have to just get it to a decent enough spot and then come back and do that without the camera on. But
Yeah.
and also apologies to those who had my camera bouncing around. It was, yeah, it's because my brush was bashing into it. Actually, talking of brushes, I thought I'd just do a little shout out. In terms of brushes, the other one that the painters will often talk about is Winsor & Newton Series 7s. So whenever anyone says, "Oh, what brushes do you use?" It's the answer is usually Winsor & Newton Series 7s. But as you can see here, I tend to use, and I have used for quite some time, Rosemary & Co. Series 33 size 0. I pretty much use this for everything, and the reason for that is I guess it was on a painters forum a little while ago, and somebody many years ago, and people were talking about this particular brand of brushes, and the painters were enjoying using it, and I gave them a go. And the thing is, I like I like how the brush interacts, as in how it holds the paint, and it's got a pretty decent point, and a very good point, and what they call the snap. So how kind of bendy in fact I'll demonstrate it here on his pickaxe. So I guess the snap will be how the bristles just kind of ping back into shape, and how firm I guess it is. So when they talk about, if something has a strong snap, it probably means it's a very firm, rather than it being a bit kind of sort of wishy-washy, right?
How does that help you exactly?
Well, the snap, I suppose it helps to maintain the shape, maintain the point, and I guess it would be like drawing with a pen or a pencil versus has no snap at all. That's a hard surface, so you're always going to get that hard point, whereas a soft brush with kind of loose bristles is just going to kind of sort of just wash over, or just kind of flow over the model. I think this Rosemary & Co. Has a low snap compared to to what I've heard people say of the Winsor & Newtons.
Yeah.
I've got used to painting with it as well, and they're very cheap. I think they're about a third of the price of your Winsor & Newton. So I tend to have been happy with them. So I just thought I'd give them a bit of a shout out. I will caveat though, before people rush out and buy loads of them, and then basically spam me and send me hate messages, that I have noticed that I think the last one I used, the end kind of, I think the quality of it maybe was a little bit varied, or the quality of production is maybe varied or diminished a little, or maybe I just got a bad one, and the point started to go, and it started to splay a bit. So, but the thing is that they're very reasonably priced. So
when I was using them, I had quite a few bad Winsor & Newtons.
Oh, right.
I think I might have had to return 1 in 6, something like that.
Right.
But next time I use Broken Toad, and I'm going to buy you a couple next
Please
time.
Please do, yes.
Next time I'm shopping, because I'd be interested to hear what you think of them. I don't. People ask me this question, and my advice usually is just experiment a little bit. Don't get hung up. There's no right answer, because what's right for one person is not right for someone else. It depends partly on your style, but I also think it depends a lot on just what you're used to. And if you start off using one thing, you'll learn how to use it to its best advantage. But I like the Broken Toad brushes. I find they're a little bit thinner. In fact, the proportions are similar to your Rosemary & Co. I think maybe they're a little longer in the bristle, but I certainly prefer them over the Winsor & Newton. I wouldn't say they're better necessarily. They just suit my style of painting better.
Yeah, and that's definitely a key key aspect, isn't it? As you said, I think it's good to call that out. That as with many things, there is no right or wrong. There are those that suit your particular style. When we were talking about paints, it's the same. For me, I like the way the scale color paints are working, and it may not be a particular formulation of paint that works for others. I'll tell you what. I'm going to call
Well,
it.
it's tools in general, isn't it?
Yeah,
People get very when they want to improve it at something, or when they get interested in a topic, their mind always tends to dwell more on the kit than it should, I think.
yeah,
And at the end of the day, if you're using oh, hey, hang on, I'm not in studio um, painter capacity, so I can say what I like. If you're using a rubbishy Games Workshop brush, then there is a limit to how much you're going to learn on that brush. You'll probably hit a ceiling where the tool just isn't good enough for you to reliably reproduce techniques that require a better quality tool. But the flip side of that is if you go out and buy a 15 quid brush, um, and you aren't a very experienced painter, then the subtleties of that brush are going to be completely wasted on you. And so the best thing to do is just improve your technique and experiment with the tools you're using and find your own way. And I think paint is a big part of that. I think there's so little to hold the different brands of paint apart. They're all fine. Then none of them are going to make you a significantly better painter just by changing brands.
yeah, absolutely. And I've found as well that actually um, it varies a lot by company as well. I think I've yet to find one. Now, jury's still out on scale color because I'm new to using them, but certainly with all the other paint brands I've used, I've had good and bad examples in each. Um, so
Yeah,
I
absolutely. I mean, I use certain colors from Privateer Press. I don't use much Games Workshop paint, but there are a few colors I will actively seek out because I haven't found a better version of that color elsewhere.
absolutely. I've actually really enjoyed their oranges and reds GW.
Games Workshop,
Yeah,
yeah, their oranges are good.
yeah. Whereas I've had troubles with Vallejo oranges and reds. So and yeah, like what you called out, was it P3 Privateer
Yeah,
Press? This classic. Look at that, coal black. I think
coal black,
everyone
yes.
should have that in their
Yeah,
in their collection. Go out and get yourself some coal black. The great thing about that, it's just a very very dark green, sort of turquoisey green, but
yeah,
very dark, and it's a great shade color. More color theory, basically cold colors. So those on the blue green side of the color wheel tend to recede, and warm colors tend to kind of come forward. If that makes any sense.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so
It's
so it kind of makes sense that a you would use a cold color in your shadows because it will tend to recede, whereas a warmer color in your highlights, and therefore something like that deep turquoise is a really good sort of shade all. Right,
and you generally want your shadows to be a bit desaturated as well, I think.
yes, again because saturated colors tend to recede. Sorry, to come into the foreground, and desaturated colours will go off into the distance,
Yeah,
which is why
coal
you often,
black is a very nice desaturated
yeah,
dark turquoise, isn't it?
indeed. Um, so yeah, so when you'll see, like a hazy, um, some sort of hazy, sort of foggy mountainscape or something like that, then what you'll see that the in the distance it will be almost grey, and stuff in the foreground will be nice,
Yeah,
nicely
it's because the
saturated.
blue spectrum of light travels further.
Check you out, you geek.
Yeah, yeah. It's the only thing I know about science, how it affects color.
Oh no, yeah, I forget. Of course, you studied a bit of was it art history? Am I
Well,
outing
I
you
went,
as an art student?
I did 2 years at art school. I did a foundation year in the first year of a degree, and rather than drop out and go and do an art degree, I dropped out of art school and went and did a history degree.
Oh, I think I may have. Um, did I get a little bit of a hair? That's something I have to be a bit careful of in our dusty flat. Is I don't know if you have this, James, but or those of you who are watching, if they're painting and yeah, but if I'm not careful, I can get little tiny dust motes or whatever landing in my landing in my palette, and before I know it,
Yeah,
I've
that's
painted. And
infuriating.
this is probably going on a little bit thinner than I should have it actually. I've thinned it a bit too much, so you can see what's happening here. It's almost like I'm sort of watercolor painting. Now there's interesting texturing happening, and this is something I think that painters are exploring a lot. I've noticed. So miniature painters are starting to explore texturing, and I will probably do a bit of texturing on this satchel. Let's just try and speed up, get some tones on there, so we can move towards that. Oh dear, it's very splotchy. Um, yeah, so basically, painters now are really starting to explore working with texture, and what that's about is actually mimicking how the light would reflect off textures um, that may not actually be there on the sculpt.
Yeah,
So I think
a bit of trompe l'oeil.
indeed, um, I'm not. I'm trying to think. Is that trompe l'oeil? Is that where they you'll sometimes see them where they've painted um, where you see like walls painted like they're real, or is that was that trompe l'oeil?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You've got you sort of, instead of having a piece of molding or architrave around the top of the wall, you paint it on, and you paint shadows as well, so it looks like, with perspective, it looks like it's really there when it isn't. Trompe l'oeil, I think it's just trick of the eye, I think.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, my schoolboy French is has escaped me, but I think that's what it means.
um, so yeah, you essentially, and I think I've done it a little bit um, on Sage here, where I've put highlights on the shirt. I've kind of just sort of dabbed it a little bit. So rather than
Yeah,
just doing a smooth glaze, what I want to do, or a smooth blend, sorry, is I will actually just do kind of little dot highlights.
yeah.
Um,
I think it's more visible on the belt.
yes, that's true. Yes, that's a good point. Yeah. So I deliberately wanted it to look a bit kind of worn and
Yeah,
um, yeah. So I don't think that texture is really there in the sculpt. But yeah, I just sort of by kind of just dotting on those highlights, and it just really makes it look as if, and again and also on the edges of the leather as well, and a little
yeah.
bit of I did a little bit of just kind of dotting of highlights on the belt straps there. Um,
A bit of battle damage.
yeah, and we that's not there on the sculpt. I think it was pretty smooth, but it just helps to kind of add that bit of texture. Now
Yeah, adds a bit of realism, a bit of interest.
I'm struggling a little bit with this one. I'm getting quite a blotchy finish here, so it's going to require a little bit of work. But um, and that
So
might
why is that, do you think? Just
it may be this is a paint that I've not used, and that's just a characteristic of the paint, or um,
So that's another important thing to say about paint ranges, is that they are inconsistent. You think that it's all the same product, but with different color. But that isn't how it works at all. That isn't the science of paint.
no. And I guess the different pigments work differently depending on the colours.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, you definitely, and it can also be within um, within the same obviously the same brand. You can get this one paint will behave in a particular way, and even with the same color, actually, I mean, I've definitely had that with some Vallejo paints where I've actually found that they oh yeah, this is definitely going on all blotchy, but to be honest, this isn't going to bother me too much, because I think that blotchiness, I'll be able to work with that as I'll be able to sort of disguise it as a kind of texture. But in terms of going for a really smooth finish, I think that might have caused me a bit more consternation. Yeah, it might well be because these are just new paints that I've not used before. Also, and this is very hard to. I mean, I don't know if you've had this, or people watching have had this happen, but some days it just doesn't gel, and I find on those days, you just got to put the brushes down, go and have a bit of a break, and come back, and then for some reason it clicks, and I can't I can't work out. Is there something materially different? Was it a humidity thing, or I suspect more likely it's just my head isn't quite in the right place.
I definitely find there are times where the best thing I can do is stop painting, go away, and come back to it the next day.
Absolutely. Right, what are we going to do for the shadows here? Yeah, let's get that contrast in, because that might help me as well. Now, when I'm doing shadow, and it's hard to see on this on the actual palette over here, but that is really quite wet. I've probably flooded that a bit too much, but usually when I'm shading, doing the shadows, I'll go for much thinner paint, and it just helps because I know that paint is going to naturally get pulled into the shadows. Into the recesses. Whereas if I'm doing highlights, then I really will tend to keep I'll go for a much. Sorry, pull that on screen. I'll go for a much thicker paint, because I know that if I go for it wet, then it's just going to flood. It's just not going to work. Oh yeah, this one's. It's definitely causing me a bit of grief here, but hey, I think the thing to and hopefully that people watching will see is that it happens to all of us. I mean, that even people who've been painting for quite a while will have those times where it just doesn't work, and you have to just push on through it, or take a break, come back to it later. But in some ways, I'm disappointed it happened, but actually, in some ways, I'm kind of glad to have shown it as well. Right now,
well, that's the thing. I think a lot of people have this idea that if you're really good at something, it means that it's effortless and you do it really quickly, and you never make mistakes and things like that. And actually, my experience is that a lot of the time, the difference between being really good at something and not is the determination that you have to get it right. And that doesn't work in the space of an hour. That's over years that you build that up. But if you have that consistent determination to raise the standard of what you're doing, then you learn to apply that attention to detail, and you learn to persevere when something goes wrong, not to say, oh well, it'll do and I'm just going to move on because that's difficult, but to say, no, I'm not happy with that, so I'm going to correct it. And if I then Somebody said this to me about eyes ages and ages ago. They said, a very good painter. They said, I probably have to redo eyes 5 times each. The first one is fine, it's easy, but getting the second one so that it matches the first one, I'm rubbish at it. And when you look at the eyes on their models, they're all brilliant. But to hear that that's a struggle is a lesson.
Yep, yeah, I'm totally with you there, and likewise, I paint eyes many times. So if we look at Sage's eyes, actually they came together quite. I think I got lucky with them, and I'm reluctant to. In some ways, I sort of think, oh, I wonder if I could just crank up the contrast a little bit more, just to really make them kind of pop out a bit more. But I know I could then disappear down a hole of going mucking it up and then having to come back and do it many more times. But
Yeah, I think I've said to you before the example that if you've ever seen the film The Little Shop of Horrors.
yeah,
So the guy's a florist and he's arranging this bunch of flowers, and I can't remember what flowers they are, but they're big flowers, and half of them are the wrong height. So he cuts them so that they're the right height, and now they're too short. So he squares them all up again and then puts them down and cuts the other ones. And he keeps on doing this until in the end he's got like 3 inch tall, 3 inch tall flowers. And you can definitely do that. You sort of correct a mistake and overcompensate, and then correct again and overcompensate. And um, sometimes saying I'm going to stop doing this and do something else and going back to it is the best thing, I think.
yeah, and you can always have that kind of the crossword effect, right? Where you can't think of you get stuck and you're looking at this crossword puzzle or whatever puzzle it is, and you just can't figure it out. You put it down, go to bed, wake up the next morning, pick up the crossword. Oh, it's obvious. That's the answer.
Yeah,
Our brains have an amazing ability to solve things while we sleep or while we're distracted and thinking about something else. Um, so I think, I mean, I've managed to recover this a bit. I think maybe part of it was that I just didn't have enough paint on, and I think it was just a bit it was just a bit uneven, kind of blotchy coverage. And now that I've got a more kind of opaque kind of coverage, that um, it's sort of hidden the blotchiness that I had. Sorry, I keep having to steady my phone as I kind of clock it when I'm painting at this angle here. So I was talking a bit about texture. Actually, so I think one of the reasons why. So this was an interesting example here where I took some shortcuts actually, and maybe that's part of what the problem was as well. I talked about how I paint and how I don't block in all the mid-tone. Now I may and this may be a false economy actually for me, that if I had blocked in all those, got it all one colour, then and made sure that I had a smooth surface, then when I'm doing my highlights and shading, that actually it I would have been further along, I suppose, rather than the
yeah.
sort of rescue job that I had to do there. So I think that's an interesting one. And to be fair, I have been doing a little bit more of that, which is kind of trying to get more solid colours down before I start shading. Which is what I did there. Is I think I just I jumped in and started trying to shade before I even had a solid base for the shading to go on.
Yeah.
But again, interesting kind of interesting learnings, and of course we're always learning, right? I'm sure you've got some anecdote or some saying from a wise philosopher about that, James.
I don't know. Is it from Rick and Morty by any chance?
I think we should have a Rick and Morty quote. I don't know if you're
I
allowed
can't think of one
swearing
now,
on
but
swearing and inappropriateness on your channel. But
I think it's my YouTube channel. I can do what I like, but
Yeah, it's quite messy and muddy, but hey, I'm enjoying it, and um, it'll come together eventually. I know that. I think that's coming back to what I was saying earlier about confidence. That I guess I've reached that point in my painting where I know how to that I know it's not the end of the world. I don't want to just throw the mini out the window. I think, okay,
Yeah.
that's not quite working out as I expected, but I've probably got a good idea of how I can fix it. So,
Well, I don't know if you ever went through this stage, but certainly, when I was first starting out painting, um, I'd I'd make a mistake that just seemed irretrievable, and it was usually on the face, and it was usually to do with using too much paint and basically killing the detail, or overworking an area so that you had such a build-up of paint, or that the paint surface was really uneven and bobbly, so that whatever you tried to do, it just wasn't going to look right.
yeah, yeah, that's it. As long
So I
as you
think once
haven't
you
flooded it in big swathes of thick, creamy paint, that is sounding a bit rude. Then yeah, you can recover from it. You can paint on it, and actually, I'd say that potentially you could have those little mistakes and those little bits of um, wayward colours that maybe they don't quite disappear when you're tidying up over the top of them. They just add to it. Just give you a little bit more visual interest, I think.
Yeah, definitely sometimes I think that's true.
Did I just hear your cat, James?
Yes, yeah, she's decided it's meal time, and she's actually got another half an hour, but that's cats for you. She'll have a go.
Indeed. Um,
So talk us through exactly what your sort of thought process is when it comes to thinning the paint in the different aspects of what you've been doing with that pouch.
um, so really, I mean, like I said, I think so. What I'm doing right now is I'm just kind of doing a bit of black lining, and I kind of I'm assuming that what I'm doing right now is going to need some tidying up because I'm being a little slapdash with it anyway, and I think probably what you're seeing here is quite an inefficient process, and I'm not sure. I feel like I'm being a little inefficient, even by my standards. There's definitely a lot of I'm making a lot of mistakes, which I'm then just kind of tidying up, but it's quite useful for.
Well, it's
Um,
not so easy to paint angling a model at a camera that's basically in your face, is it?
there is that. Um, yeah, it's a slightly unnatural painting angle, um, but anyway, it's yeah. As I think it's kind of useful anyway, just in terms of. So yeah, see, I think it's really messy there, but I'm not too bothered because, as I said, I am going to go back in with a paint, and I'm actually in answer to your question there, James, about how I was thinning things. So I actually was using a fairly thin black, just pure black there, actually, just to get into those shadows. I think they call them occlusion shadows, where the light just can't reach. So if you have your hold up your fingers, then you see these kind of the lines here. I think these are called
Yeah.
occlusion shadows, right? Where actually you could see a gap between them, but that actually this line that we get is actually as it goes right into that sort of recess, the light just doesn't reach. So actually, I mean, it's not quite black, but it's a very a fairly dark shadow. So
Yeah.
essentially, what the black lining does is it sort of represents that concept of occlusion shadows. So and I was using a fairly thinned. I don't know what sort of ratio. It's hard to say what ratio. Probably a 50-50. 1-to-1 water to paint, maybe 3-to-1. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm sort of flooding it a bit into the into those recesses, and now I'm coming back in. Hold it a bit higher. Coming back in and just tidying it up so that, and this is with a much more opaque paint.
And are you sort of overlapping the lines a little bit so that
Yeah.
those two, again, what we were talking about the acrylic paint having opaque, a level of transparency that you can play with opacity and transparency to create smooth transitions effectively.
Yes, that's right. So there have been a number of miniature painters have brought out a number of books of late. So Angel Giraldez, not sure if I've pronounced his name correctly, but has done a couple, and Jeremy Bonamont Teboul has done a very good one. I like his a lot, and also just recently I got one from RC's, so RC's
Yeah.
Painting Studio, and I think it was in the RC's book I realised that the approach he uses is kind of closest to the way I tend to do my glazing, which is I'm not sure if I can give you where sorry, not glazing, where I do my blends, how I do my blends, which is I tell you what, let's go and wonder if we can pick an area and sort of try and demonstrate the technique. That won't kind of ruin stuff. You may notice as well, there's some little glistens of metal showing. Sage is a big lad. He's a heavy chunk of metal, and I've got him sat on a the only thing that I had to hand on my painting station, which was actually this plastic pot, and which is very light because it's plastic. So he's a bit top heavy and has a habit of toppling over when if I'm not being careful. So he has
Yeah,
kind
I
of
have
fallen
that problem
over a
myself.
bit.
I tend to mount things on corks, and that's no good for him at all. I've got a whole bunch of corks with magnets on, and I use a baking tray. Basically, I put all
Yeah.
the models on a magnetic baking tray, but there's just no way with him.
Right. I'll see if I can demonstrate a blend. So what I'll do is I will just very quickly paint this armband, whatever it is. Probably using a similar kind of colours to we had going on that leather thing there. So what I'm going to use is a bit of the black in the shadows. I'm going to go up through to deck tan. I might, yeah, again, might just use a little touch of that walnut from before, and up through to deck tan, which you'll see on the palette there. It should be in display. So so let's say if I go for this kind of get a sort of a mid-tone on, right, let's get that so that it's hopefully in shadow, sorry, in shot. Okay, so we'll try and block this all out. Oops. Okay, so if I wanted to say, keep taking him off the camera, try and find an angle where I can sort of demonstrate and paint for you while it's clear what's going on. Okay, right. So actually, I think I might pull that a little bit darker. So let's see. Let's just do that, and then if I go, I suppose almost to a full deck tan, and then just get a little kind of almost like a metallic sheen kind of going down there. So this like line of light reflecting is, this is sort of assuming that this is a slightly shiny leather kind of gauntlet, I suppose. And what I've chosen here, and this is an interesting one. So people will have probably heard of the term non-metallic metal, and essentially what we're doing is we are trying to mimic a metallic surface, but just using matte, non-metallic paints. So in this case, I'm making this almost look like it's like a shiny, maybe it's a sort of a steel or something, given the colours I've got here.
Yeah.
But the thing with that, and this is what I think is a bit of a classic challenge for us as miniature painters, because we are painting a three-dimensional object, and we're using flat colours. So we're essentially choosing where the highlights are, where the light reflections are, using paint, and we're highlighting those using paint. Then what we're doing is we're essentially saying, looking at this model from this particular angle, this is how the light would reflect.
Yeah.
Reflect. Now, if it was an
You're kind of
actual, sorry, go on.
you're imposing a viewing angle in a strange sort of way.
Yes, absolutely. And so, people may have seen those back in the early days of non-metallic metal. It was all the rage when you were seeing these incredible pieces of non-metallic metal painting. What they called Sky Earth
Yeah.
NMM, right? Was
The
the name for it.
the old. Oh, yeah, showing my age here. I think anyone over the age of 30 who remembers a White Dwarf magazine from their childhood, that's Sky Earth non-metallic metal, the logo.
Oh yeah, yeah. So which is kind of it's come back around, I think, in terms of your sort of retro 80s.
It's a really 80s look, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right, kind of chrome thing. Right, so I've just come in with some actual white here as well. I'll probably come back to that later. Um, so so this kind of so I'll just show you where I'm. And hopefully the camera can see that it's pretty rough. It's pretty splotchy, right? So I've got a sort of a mid-tone there. It goes off to a bit of shadows at the side, and then I've got this deck tan kind of bar, this line here, and then I've just sort of picked out on the edge as well. And basically what I'm going to do now is kind of blend it in, hopefully, and I'll probably, while people are watching, I'll have to keep going back and forth. But again, that doesn't matter. I will
Yeah.
just keep going back and forth till I'm happy with it, and with practice I just get faster. I make less mistakes at it, I think. So what colour have I just picked up there? Probably something that's going to be yeah. So I think this is a technique. I think this is something that RC's uses, which he calls dotting. So what I've done is I've just taken a colour which is probably about half, and sort of an even parts the black, the deck tan, and a little bit of walnut as well. So it's a fairly light colour, but it's somewhere in between the deck tan colour and the sort of mid grey, and then
Yeah.
just very lightly, and it's slightly it's slightly dilute as well, and then so it means that each dot that I put is a little bit translucent, and then I just kind of dot on here and just kind of push the paint about a little bit, and okay, it's probably gone a little bit too much there, but yeah, okay, that's sort of working. And then let's go with the next level. So I'll go in with, I think I might even go with nearly black actually. Let's see, again white. So let's see how the black goes like that. Get that contrast going. And I'm sort of pulling the paint away from. I can either dot or pull the paint away, and I think this is probably a lot of the experience when it comes to painting is just sort of, I guess, getting used to how the paints will behave.
Yeah.
Where you can just kind of splot it on and go, oh, do you know what that's going to be? Yeah, that I'm safe there, or this one I need to be a little bit
And
careful with.
learning your how your dilution is going to affect that, right? Because that's also a very important thing to be able to understand and control.
Yeah, absolutely.
And have you got any words of wisdom on that point, or do you just think it's something that comes with practice?
Um, hmm, I think I probably don't have the words of wisdom that I should have.
Well, it was a bit of a loaded question in that I really feel like that's something that you just learn to do by having experimented a lot. It's
Yeah,
not maybe it's not even practice, it's just experience. You have to get a feel for it. It's a little bit like you can't teach somebody to drive a car in a classroom. You know,
yeah,
you can teach them all the theory, but until you actually go and feel the engine and understand how the pedal responds and where the bite point is and where the bite point is depending on, the angle of the road that you're driving up or down, the incline. Those are all things that you just have to learn by sensation, really.
yeah, absolutely. That particularly clutch control, and of course it varies by car and stuff. All right, so that, I think that was a fairly quick. I mean, that looks like he's got a right shiny bracelet on there, doesn't it? Just on from that one angle. Now, obviously, turn it around here. You
Well,
can see the bit that
he
I'm
likes
pointing at.
shiny things. He is an artifactor
Oh,
after all.
okay. Maybe it should be gold then. Maybe he needs a bit of bling or something, right? So just to kind of really bring it out, I'm gonna just sort of get the edge highlights on. Not the edge highlights, the shadows there. So it's quite thin paint where I'm just putting it in there, just for sort of illustrative purposes. I don't know if this is how it will come out in the end, because so I think um, I don't know. I need to see, in terms of that sort of color balance. And what I might do, and this is an interesting thing as well. Sorry, I keep taking them off camera. Um, an interesting idea is that people will have heard a number of different terms. One of the things that a term that comes out is what's called glazing, and it's another way of getting a smooth blend. I tend not to use the glazing approach, which is I think another one I've heard is I think it's called juices, where people will a painter will take a very thinned paint and then just kind of wash over or glaze over an area many times and essentially diminish the area that they're painting on. So if I was to be using the juices technique here, what I would do is the first glaze I would say I wanted to shade with black here, for example. I would have a very thinned black, and I would just paint all the way down here on this gauntlet, most of the way
Yeah.
there. And then the
A lot
second,
of the French guys tend to use that technique, I think.
yeah. So it's you can get some really smooth blends doing it that way, but it's time consuming. It's quite I'd say laborious, but it's quite time consuming. I'm sure, as with many things, you speed up with as you get more used to it. And the second glaze that you do on a slightly diminished area, and then the third will be even more diminished, and eventually. So what you have is if you imagine these thin acetate, if you had 10 thin sheets of acetate that were all kind of smoky or black, translucent acetates, and you lined them all up and just pulled each layer back by a centimeter or so, then you would get a fairly smooth transition, and that's effectively
Yeah.
what the juices technique is, or the sort of glazing technique. Another one that
And I
people,
feel like,
sorry, go on, James.
yeah, when you see people doing that, the paint is really thin. I mean, it's like a 5 or a 10% dilution
Yeah,
or something like that, where you almost can't see it go down. You see it when it's wet, and when it's dried, there's almost no appreciable change, and it's only when they start to build up, 3 or 4 layers that you begin to see any change whatsoever.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, it requires patience and yeah, and if you're after, so yeah, I do, in terms of patience, I've definitely found it where I've been like, oh, I've been doing this for ages and it's just not coming together. But yeah, you can get some amazing smooth transitions and blends. Another one is probably a question that people would ask me about. There are two alternate blending methods, and that I tend not to use, but and I think it's largely due to just I haven't practiced. I haven't really got my head around it yet. But is wet blending or two brush blending. Oh, and
Yeah.
there's another one which is because actually wet brush blending and two brush blending. Oh, sorry, wet blending and two brush blending are essentially the same thing, I think. But
Yeah.
one you just use one brush to do it while the paint is still wet, and the other you use a second brush, I suppose. Um,
Yeah, and I wet blend. I don't two brush blend in the sense of using two colors on each, but I will use a second brush just with water to feather the edge out with just a damp brush.
yeah, um, so again, so with wet blending, essentially what you're doing is, I guess, what the oil painters, the oil masters would do, which is, the thing with oil paint is the fact that it stays wet for I don't know, 24 hours. How long does oil paint stay wet, James?
It does depend on what you've done to it, how much oil you've put in it, how much turpentine you put in it, how thin you've painted it, etc. But it can take weeks.
Yeah, and so certainly within hours, or even a day or so, you can push that paint around, and you can blend with that paint, right? So you can stick another oil over the
Yeah,
top, and then you can mix them together actually on the painting and get really smooth blends.
yeah.
And that's essentially what you're doing with wet blending. Only with acrylics, you don't have a great deal of time to work with it unless you use
Yeah.
some sort of retarder
Well,
medium.
my brother-in-law, well, ex-brother-in-law really, except never really brother-in-law, but he is a very good miniatures painter, and he paints almost exclusively with oils. He uses metallic acrylics, but everything else he uses oils. But it takes him about 3 or 4 weeks to paint a miniature. He keeps it in the fridge.
Just to extend
Yeah,
the life of
yeah.
it. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, and the effect is very, very good, but it's not a practical way for anyone to paint to get stuff on the gaming table. And I think if you're painting for money, it's not practical either. It's a sort of competition technique only,
Yeah,
and the effect is very, very good, but it's just again it's a different technique. It's not better than any of the very good acrylic techniques. It's just a different way of doing things.
yeah, yeah. That's it. I mean, you'll all, and I guess the thing to say is, just go and explore, try them out. You might find something that really works for you. Um, the another one that's been an interesting one of late. I'll see if I can replicate it for you. Again, it's one that I'd love to practice a bit more. I think it was Ben Comets that did this, which was the loaded brush technique. I don't know if people have heard of that, but essentially what you do is, and I might pull and this is probably going to fail terribly because I'm certainly not practiced in it. I had a quick play with it and
I've
thought, oh,
never
that's
even tried. I'm fascinated by the
yeah.
idea,
This
but
is
I've never
let's
even
see
tried
how
to do
this
it.
happens. This is another excellent live experiment. But essentially, what you do is the idea being, and I don't know how thin. This is probably a bit thick, but um, essentially you load your brush. So I've just put a bit more water on. Okay, so you load your brush. So actually, see the brush has got a bit too, probably a little bit too much on. But um, so the brush has got this sort of red orange colour on it. It's pretty loaded.
Mm.
It's lost its point a little bit while it's got that much paint on it as well. Let's try and. regain the point. Then what he would do is just on the tip of it stick another colour, and then what you do is you would. This is going to go horribly wrong because I think I've already overloaded it a bit, but you would. Let's do it on here. So where I start painting, so I have the original colour. So sorry, not the original colour. So now you'll notice that the second colour's coming in, and and I've actually, there essentially we're doing a bit of wet blending. Again, the light's not picking up very well, and I didn't do a particularly good job of that. Shall I have another try? Like I said, this is something that I've not really experimented too much with, but in the hands of a master, you can get some amazing results. So let's go back here, and you would do that, and then eventually you'll see the other colour starts to come through. It was probably a little bit too thin, but and also painting those, it was a little bit translucent, but I think you get the idea, and it's maybe something that people would want to explore. That you essentially you've got a pretty quick blend, and when you see, I think it was Ben Comet. So apologies to the inventor of the technique if I've called it out wrong.
No, it definitely is Ben Comet's.
Yeah, and he would. He's if you've ever seen any of his painting, any painting tutorials of him doing it, he makes it look effortless and super quick and easy. I mean, what I'm doing right now is probably just going back and sort of, I guess, doing a bit of a glaze to. I probably mucked it up, but anyway, that's. What we mean. So essentially, although I wasn't necessarily demonstrating it particularly well, or it wasn't coming out brilliantly, at least that gives you a sense of, if someone's talking about the loaded brush technique, that's what they're talking about. Essentially, you load up your brush with one colour, and then you pick another colour and just put the tip of the brush, and then as you're painting with that colour, so the original colour will slowly make way for the colour that was loaded onto the brush. So many different ways to blend. Pick the one that works for you. I tend to.
Well, the funny thing is that, I mean, I think I've mastered nothing, but I kind of, not that, but certainly I do a little bit of glazing, a little bit of wet blending. I sort of mix between a lot of different techniques, and I think it's because I haven't really found exactly what I'm, the way to. I haven't really found my technique yet, I think, is the issue. But I think experimenting with these things is really important, and finding. There's another thing you hear artists say quite often, which is don't be afraid to fail. And that's one of those things that you hear it enough, it sounds like a bit of a cliche, but actually it's really, really true. It isn't just that kind of old cliche about, if you never try anything, then you'll never get good at anything. It's also just learning to experiment and find out what works for you and what doesn't work for you, but also just practice something that you're bad at until you're good at it.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's just that whole 10,000 hours thing.
Yeah.
So sorry, I keep pulling him off the camera.
What I find interesting watching you paint, actually, as much as anything else, is how your palette evolves. And mine at this stage is a complete mess, an
Really?
absolute and total mess. Yeah, I have to change baking paper probably. Yeah, well, we'd be approaching the stage where I'd have filled it up by now. So I'd be looking at changing it to the next one.
Right. Just because you're switching back with different colours, or do you a bit slapdash on the um, on the on the palette where you'll just kind of splosh the paint all over the place, or you would
I
have
think
just
I
probably
think
been
there
painting
I think
faster and getting more
maybe
colours on.
I'm not sure. Is we should actually sit and paint. Well, we have done before, but I've never really spent a lot of time watching what you're doing. I have a feeling that I might vary my dilution a lot more than you do, and I also have a feeling that you have much tighter control over your dilution than I do. I'm experimenting with it a bit more.
Right, I see.
So I make a mix. I'm like, no, that's not quite right, and I adjust the mix, and then I say, yeah, I like that, and so that's why I've got a million little twirly lines on the palette where I'm pulling the brush back from the color and seeing how it's coming off the brush and whether I like it or not before I so I'm adjusting um, what's on my brush before I take it to the miniature.
I see. Yeah, I think because I tend to keep my dilution fairly low. Generally, I'm always sort of nervous about the about it flooding and so on. So it's only when I'm doing some sort of um, deep shading that I will uh, tend to over dilute. So keep it
Well, I
fairly
think
thick. But
a tip that I have given people, I don't actually do it anymore, but something that really helped me to begin with was moving over to a wet palette was huge, absolutely huge. And the other thing was I just kept a piece of kitchen towel, and as I diluted the paint, I then wicked the excess moisture off on a bit of towel before it went to the miniature. Um, and that um, also solved a lot of problems for me in terms of it flooding, in terms of me having the wrong dilution and making mistakes and making a mess.
yeah, and to be honest, I am doing that a lot. Anytime, I don't know if you can hear the little kind of rattling sound. That is actually
Yeah,
me. Um, so actually, I guess the process is, and maybe I need a third camera, which is actually on me, which is I stick it in the water, jiggle it about a little bit, and I'll kind of wipe off the excess, and then stick it in my mouth. The brush that is. Stick the brush in my mouth just to kind of reform the point.
yeah,
And I seem to do that pretty much after every.
yeah. And again, I tend to do that on the palette with paint on. So as I've loaded my brush, I pull back from the color and I twist against the paper to form a point.
Right, yeah.
Um, so consequently, my palette is just a complete mess of little sort of, zigzaggy lines where I'm forming a point and testing the paint and making sure I like what's coming off the brush or the way it's coming off the brush.
So I think we just had our first technical glitch, James, where you were coming through and you were speaking like a Dalek or something. Not quite sure what was going on there, whether you got some interference or something.
Okay, well, I was in fairness talking nonsense anyway, so.
No, I'm sure it was all um, very useful stuff.
Well, no one will ever know.
No, I think they will know. It was just yeah.
Oh, it might just be you.
No, I think it's we got a little bit of buzzing on your line, unfortunately, but which has
Yeah.
only just started, thankfully. Well, I assume that's the case.
Well, we are coming up to 2 hours, which is what we put on the clock, isn't it? So how time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah, I mean, I hope people have found it interesting. I feel like I've been a little bit slapdash with it, but there's a lot of things I guess we talked about, probably a bit of the theory stuff, but hopefully people have got a bit of a sense of how I paint, certainly under artificial conditions anyway, while I'm having to explain what I'm doing as well. And obviously, people, Drowned Earth folks will have got a nice preview of our friend Sage, and how he's coming along.
Yeah. I mean, he's coming along very nicely. I think it's fair to say that this whole filming process has slowed you down quite a lot. You're definitely somebody who doesn't rush, and somebody who wants to make sure you get things right and take the time to allow yourself to do that. But having a camera in between you and the model isn't going to help in terms of speed. And also talking. You're constantly your brain is in two different places.
Yeah, indeed. I think unfortunately you're getting a little bit of echo now, a buzzing echo, James. I don't know what. Whether your headset decided 2 hours was enough.
maybe. Let's feel the computer. It's quite cool. On a laptop. Well, I think that's a really good place to leave it in any case.
Okay, cool. Well, hopefully it's been interesting for people listening in. Certainly something I want to do. I want to do more of. So it'd be great to hear feedback from people in terms of, how they found the session, how annoying it was with me doing this, that, or the other, or I really welcome any feedback people have, or if they have any questions.
Well, I've been monitoring and a little bit involved in the live chat. But I think if anybody has any solid feedback, they can leave it in the comment section after we stop streaming, or just feel free to send it to me on Facebook or on Kickstarter. Either way. So I guess it's time for the inevitable plug, which is in the comment section below, is the link to the Kickstarter. We're trying to think of as many fun and exciting things for people to do during the Kickstarter. But either way, I hope you've all enjoyed it.
Yep. Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Cheerio.